And thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the Boston Graduate School of Theology for the welcome and hosting the two lectures. It's been a delight to get to know some of you and to spend time with you, and really appreciate your hospitality and your welcome. You made me feel very much at home. Thank you. As I always do when I have an audience these days, I would try to introduce what we're doing in Birmingham. As Keith mentioned, I run the Theopolis Institute. We started 3 years ago. It's a leadership training institute in Birmingham, and we offer courses primarily in biblical studies and liturgical theology and liturgical practice, and also some courses on the theology of culture and Christian cultural engagement. And we've been doing that for the last several years by offering a series of week-long intensive courses in Birmingham. Students come and spend the week worshiping and hearing lectures and engaging in seminar discussions. We eat meals together, kind of a week of monastic life for the students, and some of them stay together at the church manse, and it becomes kind of a Theopolis frat house for the week. Not a sorority house yet, but we do welcome women students, but it's been mainly men and mainly a frat house. So if you're interested in keeping up with what we're doing or finding out more, I have a sign-up sheet that I'm going to send around that has a slot for your name and a slot for your email address. And if you're interested, we can sign you up for our monthly e-newsletter, which is called In Medias Res. And that will include updates on the things that we're doing at Theopolis, upcoming courses, and also lectures that we sponsor and other activities that we're involved in. And also give you access to several of our articles that we publish. We have a website, theopolisinstitute.com, and we try to keep regular updates, have three articles a week that go up on the website. So if you want to get the newsletter, I'll send this around, and feel free to sign up. I also have some brochures for our year-long Junior Fellows program, which doesn't exist yet. We're hoping to launch it in the fall of next year, but this brochure will describe it. If you're interested in finding out more about the program, please feel free to take one. If you know somebody, a recent college graduate who is interested in theology, not yet ready to go to seminary or can't fully afford seminary, that's the kind of student we're looking for. You can take several copies and pass them on to students that might be interested in that. So if Keith, if you would start this around. Sure. And you can pass those around too if you want. Everyone can take one or two. So my topic today is the topic of my book, Defending Constantine. And for those of you who have read it and have some recollection of the book, this will sound very familiar. It's basically a summary of what I tried to do in the book and the various subjects, the arguments of the book, and with some addendums that I don't really cover in the book. I basically want to make develop 3 points. I want to talk about the historical argument that I present in defending Constantine. And then secondly, I want to talk about the topic that interested me in the project. I'm not a historian, I'm a theologian by training. And what interested me most about the project were the implications for political theology. As you may know, there's a strong strain of anti-Constantinianism within contemporary theology. And that's really what I was trying to address in the book. And in order to get there, I had to go through the lengthy historical study, and most of the book is the historical dimension, but I was aiming to get to the theological issues that surround anti-Constantinianism. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then at the end, I want to talk about some of the contributions that I hope the book makes to political theology, to Christian vision of politics, and things that the example of Constantine, the life and work of Constantine, might contribute to our thinking about that. So those 3 big items, I'll be talking about these pretty rapidly. Most of them are developed at much greater length in my book, but I'm happy to take questions at the end as well and try to clarify or develop anything that I skimmed over too quickly. So the first set of questions has to do with the historical issues surrounding Constantine. And one of the things that I discovered pretty quickly in my research on Constantine was that there is a fairly dramatic discrepancy between the popular understanding of who Constantine was and what Constantine did. Popular, I mean in popular literature that might make passing references to Constantine, but also in the work of theologians who are not historians, and the use that they make of Constantine, what they say about Constantine. There's a discrepancy between those uses of Constantine and what I was finding in some of the serious academic work on Constantine that's appeared in the last 30 or 40 years. And it quickly became apparent that the perspective on Constantine that you find in popular Christian literature and among theologians is frequently a mid-19th century perspective on Constantine that very few historians today would countenance, that very few would accept and defend. Jacob Burckhardt's view that Constantine was not a believer, he was not a convert, he was using Christianity and using the pose of Christianity for his own political purposes and manipulating the church to accomplish his own political ends. That is a popular understanding of who Constantine was and what he did that is still current today, but if you look at recent detailed biographies of Constantine and work on Constantine, you'll find that that's not the case. Historians have very little doubt that Constantine was a convert. That's not even a question anymore, but that's one of the questions that I went back to try to answer. It's a traditional question, it's a question that's still on the minds of Christians, and so I was trying to look at that as well as other questions. Was he really a Christian? Did he really believe what he believe the doctrines and believe in the faith that he claimed to profess? Also, did it make any difference in the way he ruled Rome? Was there any effect on his conduct as an emperor after his conversion? There are a couple of accounts of his conversion. If you look at the paintings of Constantine's conversion, you'll see a conflation of these different accounts. But Eusebius and Lactantius offer divergent accounts that are sometimes conflated as describing the same event. That before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, just before Constantine took the city of Rome, he had a dream, or he saw a sign in the sky with some kind of banner that said, "In this sign conquer," and then that was interpreted to him as a sign from the Christian God. There were some Christians in his company who interpreted the sign and the dream, and he painted crosses on the shields and used Christian symbols on the banners as they went into battle. And he attributed the victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, a rather miraculous victory by Eusebius' account. An Exodus-like victory, according to Eusebius, which makes one wonder if there's some typological imagining going on there. It was a dramatic victory for Constantine, and he attributed it to the Christian God, and he became a follower of the Christian God. A German historian, I followed a German historian named Peter Weiss, who argues that those two accounts are not different accounts of the same event, but they're in fact two different events that are separated by a couple of years. They occur in different locations and in different circumstances. The first occurs in about 310, according to Weiss, when Constantine was marching through Gaul, and he saw with his men, this wasn't a private vision, he saw a sign in the sky that he interpreted as a cross surrounded by a circlet or a crown. And Weiss says he actually saw this, and he thinks it was a sun halo. If you want to know what a sun halo looks like, you all have Google at your fingertips. There are some very nice pictures of sun halos, and you can get, it's the sun shining through ice crystals in the atmosphere that create a circle around the sun. You've got the disk of the sun in the middle and then a circle of light around it, sometimes a double circle of light, and then often beams of light going in a cross figure that go out to the edges of the circle. Weiss suggests that that's what Constantine saw, and that his men saw it too. And being 4th century Romans, they of course asked, what God is sending this sign? Where is this coming from? This can't be just a random sign. It's not just an atmospheric thing for a 4th century Roman. It must be a sign of something from somebody. And Christians interpret it as a sign from the Christian God. After all, it's a cross inside a crown. How else would a 4th century Christian interpret that kind of heavenly sign. That happened about 310. A couple years later, as Constantine is beginning to, the night before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, he does have a dream, and he is approached by, God speaks to him and assures him of victory. And those two events are separated events, and together they're interpreted by the Christians who are already in Constantine's company as signs from the Christian God and calls from the Christian God to devote himself to Christianity. Weiss's way of explaining those two events and explaining the conversion of Constantine seem very plausible to me. They make an enormous amount of sense within a 4th century Roman context. And that's the position I took as in the book, that he actually was converted at that point because of the sign and the dream, and because those were interpreted by Christians who were surrounding him. There were Christians already in his father's household. There was Christians in the larger company of people that surrounded Constantine. So there wasn't an absence of Christian influence even prior to that conversion. There were immediate changes in Constantine's conduct after that event, particularly after the second of those events, the dream before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. These are changes in the iconography, in the royal banners that are the standards that led the army into battle. Being 21st century Protestants, we might think, well, these are just symbols. They don't really mean that much. But for a 4th century Roman, changing the sign on your battle standard is an enormous shift of loyalty. Wars were always had a religious aura around them. You depended on the gods. As a Roman, you depended on the gods to win your battles. And the standard that you carried into the battle was the God that you hoped would help. It was the standard of the God whom you hoped, you get the sense, will help you when you go into the battle. That you're hoping that God will precede you and win the battle for you. Constantine changes to a Christian symbol on that banner, on those standards, and he uses the Christian symbol of the cross. That's a much bigger change than we might think it is. When Constantine did take the city of Rome, he marched into Rome, and the typical thing to do would be to have some kind of thanksgiving offering to God, to Jupiter perhaps, at the altar of Jupiter in Rome, which Constantine pointedly decided not to perform. So he has this dream. He thinks it's the Christian God who's given them the victory. It's the Christian God's battle standard, that leads him into victory. And so he doesn't do homage to the traditional Roman gods. And after that, Christian symbols begin to appear in public places, on coins. He begins to support the church in various ways. Very quickly, there's a extension of the decision to tolerate Christianity that goes throughout the entire empire, and Christianity becomes a legal religion, and is securely legal religion for the first time. So all the data that we have indicates that there was a real event. Constantine changed his loyalty from the traditional Roman gods to the Christian God, and that had an immediate effect, at least on the symbolic side of his public life. Did he really believe what he was saying? There's plenty of evidence from decrees, imperial decrees. There's some evidence from Constantine's own writings that were probably assisted by priests that were part of his court. But there's evidence of his commitment to the Christian God and his knowledge of the Christian faith. It's pretty common in imperial decrees coming from Constantine for him to invoke the Christian God as the God whom he's seeking to please. There's often a political edge to that. He's thinking about the Christian God in the way that you would expect a 4th century Roman to think about a God. He wants to please this God so that this God will assist him in his rule and in his warfare. That's what the Roman gods did. And now he's devoted to this new God, this Christian God, and so he's thinking about that God as his support in his various conflicts and battles as a Roman emperor. His interest in church unity, which comes to expression in his calling of the Council of Nicaea, is related to that. There are several decrees where he castigates the church for the splintering of the church and the factions that had developed over the Arian controversy. Some have seen that interest as a kind of manipulative political interest, that he's just trying to unify the church so the church and support the church so the church will give him moral and political support for his own programs. The way he phrases it in his decrees is more theological. It's a fairly simplistic theology, but it's still a theological point. The reason why the church needs to be unified, in his view, is that a disunified church, a fragmented church, will displease God. And if God is displeased, then that will be a threat to the success of Constantine's reign and to the success of Rome. So he wants the church unified for political purposes, but he's not really a sociologist who understands how a unified church could kind of support his regime. He's much more a theologian, thinking the church needs to be unified because that's what God wants of the church. God will be pleased with the unified church, and I want God to be pleased. Because if he's not pleased, then I'm in trouble and Rome is in trouble. There's, again, a kind of simplicity, maybe a simplification to that faith, but I don't have any reason to think that's insincere. He really does fear God. He fears God's anger at himself and at Rome, and he wants to do whatever he can to make sure that God is pleased. One of the most revealing statements that we have is in a document called the Oration to the Assembly of Saints. This is something that Eusebius includes in his Life of Constantine. Eusebius presents it as an example of something that Constantine regularly did at court. According to Eusebius, Constantine basically became the theological teacher of his royal court. He would regularly give sermons and other kinds of theological orations at the court. And Eusebius says that this happened often, but he only includes the one example called the Oration to the Assembly of Saints. And that gives us an idea of what Constantine believed and said, and what he was urging the court of his court to believe and to think. Again, it's likely, don't know this for sure, but it's likely that he was assisted in the writing of this oration by priests. But it's a fairly sophisticated theological statement. It's a defense of monotheism. And in defending monotheism, there's also a critique of polytheism. The defense of monotheism is largely a philosophical one. Monotheism is a necessary premise to understand and to account for the harmony of the various complex parts of the universe. There is a cosmic harmony. Things stay in order. How does that happen if you have multiple gods that are frequently at odds with each other? There has to be some ruling presence, some ruling something that organizes and harmonizes everything. Polytheism, by contrast, monotheism underwrites harmony and peace. Polytheism produces violence and conflict, domination and struggle. And so monotheism not only explains the cosmic harmony that we observe, but monotheism also has this kind of political dimension to it. Monotheism is a support for a peaceful imperial structure as opposed to the warring of different factions and different gods. That's all done in a fairly philosophical vein without explicit reference to Christianity, but part of the oration is also a defense of certain theological points, specifically Christian theological points. He discusses the generation of the Son. In what sense can we say that God the Son is generated by his Father? And he distinguishes, as the theologians of the time would have done, between natural generation and an eternal generation. The eternal generation of the Son means that there's not a before and after. There's not a time when the Son was not. But instead, the Son is generated, comes from his Father, he's derived from his Father, but timelessly and eternally. That's the same kind of distinction that you'd find in Athanasius or other 4th century figures, and Constantine expresses that. He also gives a brief summary of the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, so he knows the gospel story, at least in basic outline. He talks about some of the other events of Jesus' ministry and life, and he also points to some Old Testament prophecies of Jesus that were fulfilled at his coming. So the oration is 15 pages long, probably in a modern printed text, but it shows an awareness of the philosophical issues surrounding monotheism, and significant awareness of the theological issues that are at stake in the Council of Nicaea. And also some exposure to the contents of the New Testament and a little bit of the Old Testament. Those are all evident there. Again, there's no reason to think that you'd have to imagine a kind of hyper-cynical Constantine to think that he would write this, present it in the court, and yet not actually believe it. He's just trying to get his court to believe it, and he doesn't actually believe it. Or you'd have to think that Eusebius is a pretty cynical or distorting historian, even more than we suspect he is, to think that he just made it up, that this isn't actually from Constantine. Most scholars today would say this is actually Constantine's work, with some assistance perhaps from priests, and it expresses Constantine's own theological convictions. One of the points that's been brought up by critics of the book is that, and something that I didn't make enough of in the book, is the fact that Constantine, for all this, was not baptized until the very end of his life. So he's actually performing kind of a clerical function in the court. He's preaching to his court, and he's operating as a Christian emperor, but he's not officially brought into the church until his deathbed. And the account that Eusebius gives of that deathbed baptism suggests that Constantine had some sense of a tension between the commitment he was making in baptism and his need to operate as an emperor. He talks about that he's now coming into communion with God. He's now laying aside the imperial garb. There's a sense that he's kind of a Yoderite, that he thinks that you can't be an emperor and a Christian at the same time, which is an interesting insight into Constantine that he actually shared more with John Howard Yoder and the Mennonite anti-Constantinian tradition that they may realize. Did his conversion and his convictions about Christ and about God, did they make a significant difference in the way he ruled Rome? And I think the answer to that is definitely mixed. Constantine, before and after his conversion, could be a brutal ruler. There are way too many relatives that die in suspicious circumstances for us not to suspect that Constantine has something to do with this. There are a number of kind of scandalous stories that come out during the course of his reign. And he continued to be a very effective, one of the most effective military leaders in the Roman world. And some of that, and again, sometimes by necessity, sometimes because he's wanting to grab the entirety of the Roman Empire. But when Constantine was born, there was a system set up where the empire was divided among various emperors, and he, through timely deaths and abdications, and also through war, he eventually was able to rule the entirety of the Roman Empire. And the wars were not really defensive wars, self-defense. He was aggressively taking over portions of the empire so that he could rule it as the sole emperor. But there are some places where we can see, I think, sometimes significant changes in Rome, the way the Roman system operated, that reflect Christian direction for the Roman world. By most accounts, he outlawed the gladiatorial games officially. It was sometime before the gladiatorial games actually ceased, but he did outlaw them, and he talked about them as brutal and as not compatible with human dignity. He outlawed sacrifice. Eusebius claims this, and there's some dispute about whether he actually did that, but I think the balance of evidence is that he actually did make a decree outlawing sacrifice. Again, that's one of those things that didn't actually cease to exist for some time after his reign, but he apparently brought an end to, he decreed an end to animal sacrifice. I think that probably the best example of what Constantine did to improve the Roman legal system for common people were the changes he made to the Roman court system. Roman law and Roman justice was one of the boasting points, bragging points of the Roman system, and it had many virtues, but it was also undermined and corrupted by money and by social connections. Judges were in the same patrician social class as wealthy litigants, and so those wealthy patrician litigants had access to judges that lower class litigants would not have had. I mean, they went in the same social circles. There are satirical accounts of litigants sitting up on the bench next to the judge, whispering into the ear of the judge while he's making his decision. Probably didn't literally happen, but that's the way the satirists of the time presented it. So that was the one issue, was the social connection. The judges would have a bias, personal bias toward wealthy upper class litigants. And then there's also the issue of cost. Wealthier litigants could force out poor litigants just by continuing to appeal. If they lost one round, they could just appeal to the next round and to the next round. As long as they had money, and if a wealthy litigant would have money to keep going, they could just price their opponents out of court. Their opponents would not be able to bear the court costs that they would have to bear to keep that system going. And so the poor litigants, no matter what the justice of their cause, were often failed to get justice because of the dynamics of that system. What Constantine did was to provide for an appeal outside of the Roman civil courts into ecclesiastical courts. So at any point in a trial, in a case, one or either of the litigants could decide that they wanted to appeal to the local bishop, and then the bishop would take the case. The bishop would not charge anything, so money is taken out of the picture. The bishop might be, in some cases, a member of the upper class. He might be a patrician, but presumably he would have less class interest and less class loyalty than somebody outside of the church might. That wouldn't always be the case, obviously, but you have a better chance to have somebody who would give a fair trial. And somebody who's operating by some sense of Christian justice would be deciding the case. It was that decision that really opened up the ecclesiastical courts as one of the main courts that adjudicated cases as the Roman system began to collapse in the 4th, 5th centuries, and Roman courts were no longer functional. Ecclesiastical courts take over much of the work of those courts, not just in ecclesiastical cases, but in what used to be civil cases. I mean, if you read you can read accounts from many church fathers, and Augustine is probably a prime one, who complains about how often he has to go and act as a judge in some dispute between his litigious church members, and his North African parishioners. So that was it provided a kind of justice or possibility for justice that was not available in the Roman court system. It removed the cash discrepancy, the money discrepancy from the calculation, and it involved the church in the ruling of the Roman Empire. So I think that's a good example of a significant way that Constantine shifted the Roman Empire in a more Christian direction. The second point that I want to develop briefly is my critique of anti-Constantinianism. This comes from John Howard Yoder, is probably the one who has articulated an anti-Constantinian perspective most thoroughly and most persuasively. John Howard Yoder, a Mennonite theologian from the middle part of the 20th century, significant influence on Stanley Hauerwas, who has carried on a similar kind of a project with similar kind of assumptions. For Yoder, Constantine as a man is not really the issue. Constantine serves as a symbol for Yoder of shifts that are taking place within the church, shifts that are taking place in the church's own self-conception. So he doesn't, the fact that Constantine may not have been as bad as some people think he is, that wouldn't really affect Yoder's thesis, because Constantine just serves as a kind of symbolic marker of something that was happening in the church. And according to Yoder, there are a number of dimensions to what the Constantinian moment or the Constantinian shift did to the church. One of the primary ones for Yoder is that it led to the development of a kind of dualistic Christian ethic, which he links with the dualistic Christian cosmology and metaphysics. The dualistic Christian ethic comes out of, would develop this way. Yoder is convinced that early Christians were pacifists of some sort, that they did not believe Christians should go to war at all. But when you now have a Christian emperor, and Christians in the church begin to acknowledge the emperor as a Christian, and the emperor is going to war, you suddenly have a possibility for kind of a dual ethic. There's a quasi-Christian ethic that's not a fully Christian ethic for the emperor and for his other civil rulers, and then there are others who live by a genuine Christian ethic. You have the same kind of duality coming up because of the legalization of the church. The legalization of the church leads it opens up the church to new members. It can become socially advantageous to become a member of the church rather than a social disadvantage. And so you have a lot of people coming into the church who are not solid and zealous believers, who just see it as an opportunity to be part of this growing movement. And they aren't expected to live by the same rigorous standards that Christians were expected to live by in the early centuries. And so you have a division between that later develops in the medieval world between ordinary Christians and the religiously devoted. You have orders of monks and that's a continuation of what used to be universal in the church. Most Christians are given this kind of very light load to bear. They don't have to live according to a strictly Christian ethics. He also thinks that the Christianization of the empire and what he calls Constantinianism leads to the notion that Christians can begin to control the ways of providence. Providence was once hidden away. Now the emperor has some kind of control over the way the world goes. And so Christians are seduced into believing that they can change the world and they can manipulate the world. I think those are a couple of major points that Yoder develops in his book, The Politics of Jesus, and Peaceable Kingdom. Priestly, I can't remember the name of the title. There's another book. What's that?
I think it's Priestly Kingdom.
Priestly Kingdom. In those two books, I think it's particularly in Priestly Kingdom that he has a good succinct analysis of what he calls Constantinianism. And I share Yoder's horror at a lot of the things that he describes. I don't think, though, that they're attributable to Constantine. Yoder thinks of the Constantinian moment, however long that was, the shift that takes place, as a decisive shift in the history of Western theology and church life. And it's a permanent shift. So you have different forms of Constantinianism that come out in the medieval period and in the Reformation period and then in the modern period, but it's still Constantinian. You still have this same sense of control over over providence. You have the same kind of dualistic ethics that existed from the 4th century or 5th century on. And he sees this as a permanent feature of Western theology and of the Western church. I share Yoder's opposition and horror to metaphysical and ethical dualism. I share his horror of the kinds of compromises that Christians have made over the centuries. I don't think it's attributable to Constantine. I don't think it's inherent in that the elevation of a Christian to be head of the Roman Empire. Well, I think what Yoder has done is in a more sophisticated way than is often done, but he's basically followed an Anabaptist storyline for the history of the church, that there's a decisive change, a decisive fall of the church that takes place in the 4th century. He doesn't use that language, and he's got reasons not to use it. But the shape of his historiography is very similar. That's a very questionable account of church history. And it also leads him to be I think, wildly unfair and sometimes wildly inaccurate about some of the figures that he talks about. Some of the worst passages in Yoder are passages about Augustine, who I think Yoder should find in some ways a kindred spirit in certain ways. Augustine was skeptical of Christians in power. He's skeptical of people, so of course he's going to be skeptical of people in power. Constantine doesn't Augustine doesn't see Constantine as this kind of decisive moment in the history of the Roman Empire. In City of God, he's got a little chapter on Constantine, but he doesn't see that as decisive, and he's critical of some of the directions of the Roman Empire. So, but Yoder thinks of Augustine as simply being a Constantinian theologian, pure and simple, who is constructing a theology that just provides us support for a Constantinian system. The more penetrating critique, I think, is a theological one, and that is that Yoder and Hauerwas and others who follow this anti-Constantinian line seem to me to be falling into a kind of liberalism that they otherwise condemn. And particularly, they fall into a kind of liberalism that treats the political arena as a kind of safe zone or a secular zone that is immune to the influence of the gospel. On Yoder's terms, he has a thought experiment. I think it's in Priestly Kingdom. He has a thought experiment of what it would look like for Constantine to have been a faithful Christian in the way that Yoder would want him to be a faithful Christian. And it's an interesting passage because he does describe the kinds of things that he would want an emperor to do. A Mennonite emperor is what he has in mind. And he makes some good points there, but I think the ultimate result is that he doesn't think that you can be a successful emperor and a Christian. You can't operate as an emperor and be faithful at the same time. And the deeper problem with that, the underlying problem with that, is that you have basically an irredeemable sphere of life. You have the political world as a world of power, brute force, and that's just the way it is, and it's not going to change. It's not going to be infused with the gospel. That's a secularism that Yoder is usually against, and Hauerwas even more so, but I think it comes into their understanding of church history because of this anti-Constantinian paradigm that they're working with. Very briefly, let me talk a little bit about what I think the contributions of this study are to political theology. One of the positive account I give of Constantine centers on his decision to end sacrifice, and that's evident in a number of ways, apart from the fact that Eusebius says that he issued a decree to end sacrifice. I mentioned earlier that he did not offer sacrifice after the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He himself doesn't continue to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods. He ends the gladiatorial combats, or at least he officially ends them. And those gladiatorial combats and other ritualized violence that existed in the Roman Empire had kind of a sacrificial overtone to them. He brings an end to sacrifice, at least officially. So sacrifice is intimately connected with order, political order in the ancient world generally, not just in Rome. Sacrifice is the religious act of ancient people. It's also the founding political act for most ancient civilizations. The summary of Roman religion that's often given is that sacrifices are given to keep the gods happy, so that the gods will keep Rome happy. That's the contract that the Romans have made. So long as they keep getting pleased by the sacrifices, then they'll provide goods for Rome. Well, Constantine breaks that contract. He doesn't continue to offer the god sacrifice. And that breaks the Roman system at a fundamental level. And when Constantine is done, at least officially, Rome is no longer founded on animal sacrifice, or on human sacrifice for that matter. And the only sacrificial rites that are acknowledged. They're not necessarily performed by the Roman Empire, but they're acknowledged by the Christian emperors, are the sacrifices of Christian worship, including the sacrificial feast of the Eucharist. So that's the shift that I think is, there is a Constantinian shift, but I think it's, if you look at it from the perspective of sacrifice, that's really the shift that's going on. In a sense, what you have is Constantine acknowledging implicitly, probably not self-consciously, but acknowledging that the church is the true city, because the church is the place where you now offer an offering of praise and an offering of at least a sacrificial feast in the Lord's Supper. And you no longer offer those sacrifices in the Roman polis. It's an acknowledgement of the church's preeminence as the city of God. A second contribution is to think about the role of, or the legitimacy of Christian rule. Constantine, according to the anti-Constantinian paradigm, Constantine is seeing as this aberration, this departure from the gospel, this defection, even an apostasy. Yoder uses that term at times. There's an apostasy from the gospel when Constantine takes power and you have Christians that take charge of the Roman Empire. I think, on the contrary, that the biblical narrative and the gospel, the way the gospel fulfills the Old Testament narrative and promise, leads us to expect kings to acknowledge God and to serve his kingdom. Abraham is promised that he will be a blessing to the nations. Abraham also is promised that he will have an abundant seed and that kings will come from him. That's in Genesis 17:6 and other places, that within Abraham's seed are going to be kings. And that comes to expression in various places in the prophets. You think of prophecies in Isaiah, where kings are bringing their treasures to Zion, adorning Zion. The glory goes out, the light goes out from Zion, and the kings respond by bringing their treasures, in a vision that, of course, recurs at the end of the Bible in Revelation. You have Isaiah 2, a picture of nations coming to Zion to learn of God's ways and to receive his instructions so that they can beat their swords to plowshares and their spears to pruning hooks. That vision picks up on the pilgrimage of the nations that took place in the lifetime of Solomon, when kings actually came to listen to Solomon, to hear his wisdom and to learn how to be better kings. They came to Israel's king in order to learn how to rule more effectively. It seems to me like that the thrust of the biblical story is not that Christians will, the thrust of the biblical story, I'll put it positively, the thrust of the biblical story is that we should expect Christian rulers. We expect the Christian ruler, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, but Jesus is not alone in ruling the earth, and there are others who are called to rule with him. So that seems to me more the trajectory of Scripture rather than the opposite. The other thing I have just a minute or two to comment on is the question about the relationship between Constantine's rule and the martyrs. In the anti-Constantinian perspective, Constantine is amounts to a betrayal of martyrdom. It's a betrayal of the martyr church. Christians had suffered under the Roman Empire. Christian had taken a stance against the Roman Empire, and now Christians were supporting the Roman Empire because you now had a professing Christian as the head of the empire. There are a couple of ways to respond to that. One is to point to places, and there are plenty in the church fathers, in where the hope of the martyrs is a hope for redemption and a hope for vindication. The martyrs go to their deaths expecting resurrection personally, individually in glory, but also expecting that their blood would have some kind of effect on the world around them. There are accounts of martyrs where as they're being burned, the account says that the smoke of it's like the smoke of incense that's purifying the air and actually having kind of a redemptive effect on the people around them. So there are the mindset of the martyrs does not seem to be we're going to our deaths, and we just expect suffering and martyrdom to be carried on perpetually. The mindset of the martyrs seems to be that we go to our deaths in faithfulness to God, and God will vindicate us and lift us up, and He'll change the world that put us to death into something else. And I think that even while the martyrs are being killed and persecuted, they're already in various ways actively undermining and eroding the Roman world, even before Constantine appears. Martyrs, by their peaceable witness, expose the brutality of Roman law and Roman justice. And that becomes increasingly apparent to non-Christians of the Roman Empire as they look at these Christians who are obviously not rebels against the state, people who are good citizens, who are faithful citizens, people who help their neighbors, and yet they're being rounded up and persecuted, some killed, some burned at the stake. Why are our governors doing this? They begin to ask. It exposes the brutality of Roman power. It also exposes the impotence of Roman power. You can't do much with a movement. You can't do much with people. You can't stop a movement. That you can't. Where killing them doesn't work. That's the ultimate power that a state has, to stamp out this undesirable movement, these deplorables, to stamp them out by killing them. But that doesn't seem to stop. It seems to inspire some of them to be even more bold in their witness, even more confrontational to the authorities. How do you stop that? Well, you can stop it by just increasing the pressure and trying to kill more and more. It becomes clear even to non-Christian emperors that that's just not working. Galerius, even before Constantine issues a decree of toleration, Galerius in the Eastern Empire, not at all a Christian sympathizer, in fact, a brutal persecutor of Christians. But Galerius recognizes that this is not working. We're going to have to stop this. Or you can begin to recognize Christians, say, okay, we give up. But then the Romans are admitting defeat, and the Romans are permitting and tolerating a whole subculture with the Roman Empire that doesn't acknowledge Caesar as Lord anymore. And if that's the case, if Rome is going to tolerate that, then the Roman system has changed. Okay, the martyrdom is indefeasible. Martyrdom necessarily undermined the Roman Empire and prepared the way for something like Constantine, for a more Christian, or at least a toleration of Christians in the Roman Empire. At base, I think what the martyrs do is enact the gospel all over the Roman Empire in the decades and a couple of centuries before Constantine. All over, in arenas all over the Roman Empire, Christians are put to death, and you have a passion play. You have Christians who are peaceable, faithfully witnessing to Jesus, and put on crosses and fed to the lions and burned. And each of those is a testimony to the gospel, an enacted testimony, a preaching of the gospel in action. And so the Roman authorities, against their intentions, is actually evangelizing the Roman Empire by putting these martyrs to death. Again, I don't think that Constantine is a betrayal or a deviation from the expectations or the direction of the martyr church, but I think it's the fulfillment of the martyr church. As, of course, an ambiguous fulfillment, because Constantine isn't perfect, and the Christian Roman Empire is not perfect, but still a fulfillment of the hopes of the martyrs and a vindication of their blood and their faithfulness. Thank you very much.